Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, thanks. And also let me know where y'all are watching from and at what time. I'm curious. The bus rumbled down the narrow dirt road, its tires kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air like a shroud. Jake sat by the window, watching the forest grow denser with every mile. The trees loomed tall, their branches forming a canopy so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The isolation of the place was palpable, and it made Jake's skin crawl. He glanced around at the other kids on the bus. Most were chatting or scrolling through their phones, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of screens. Everyone seemed excited, everyone but Jake. He was here because his parents thought he needed fresh air and socialization, a polite way of saying they were sick of him moping around the house all summer. He hadn't protested. What was the point? It was just a camp. What could go wrong? The bus jerked to a halt, jolting Jake from his thoughts. A wooden sign reading, "Welcome to Camp Willowbrook," stood crookedly by the road, its paint peeling and weathered by time. The counselors stood in a cheerful line, waving as the kids filed out. Their uniforms were a bright, cheery yellow, almost too bright, and their smiles felt forced. "Hey there," a man with a booming voice greeted the group. He introduced himself as Mr. Eric, the head counselor. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, but there was something in his gaze that made Jake uneasy, a gleam that seemed too rehearsed. "Welcome to Camp Willowbrook, where every day is an adventure." Mr. Eric's enthusiasm was met with scattered cheers. Jake just adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and followed the group toward the cabins. The campgrounds were picturesque, almost idyllic. A clear lake shimmered in the distance, and rows of rustic cabins lined a dirt path, but the perfection felt staged, like a picture on a postcard that didn't quite capture reality. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching them, its ancient trees standing sentinel. Jake's cabin, Cabin 5, housed 5 other boys around his age. They introduced themselves with the usual mix of awkwardness and bravado. There was Marcus, the self-proclaimed athlete, Tyler, a lanky kid with a sarcastic streak, and Ben, who barely spoke but smiled shyly when he did. The cabin smelled of pine and damp wood, a combination that would have been comforting if it weren't for the strange symbols etched faintly into the wooden beams above each bunk. Dinner that night was a communal affair in the large mess hall. The counselors served a hearty meal of spaghetti and garlic bread, their cheerful chatter a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere that Jake couldn't shake. Every laugh seemed too loud, every joke too hollow. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the camp transformed. Shadows stretched long and dark across the grounds, and the forest seemed to close in. Jake lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, the unease gnawing at him. Sleep came reluctantly, and with it a single, unshakable thought. Something about this place isn't right. Jake woke to the sound of birdsong, though it lacked the comforting melody he was used to. The chirping was sharp, almost discordant, like the birds were screaming instead of singing. He shook off the unease, chalking it up to his imagination, and headed to breakfast. In the mess hall he spotted Emma, the girl he'd briefly noticed on the bus. She had curly auburn hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that made her seem older than the rest. She was sitting with another girl named Lily, who had an infectious laugh. Jake hesitated before approaching, but eventually slid into the seat across from them. "Morning," he said, trying to sound casual. Emma looked up, studying him for a moment. "You're the quiet one, huh?" Jake shrugged. "Just not a morning person." Lily grinned. "Well, you'll have to be. These counselors act like they're running a boot camp, not a summer camp. Did you see the schedule?" She slid a paper across the table. The list was packed with activities some expected, canoeing, hiking, but others seemed odd. Group reflection by the fire, midnight star watching, and special camp gatherings stood out, the vague descriptions doing little to explain what they were. "Special camp gathering, what's that about?" Jake asked. Emma leaned in, lowering her voice. "It's creepy, right? I asked one of the counselors about it yesterday, and they just smiled and said, it's a surprise." "Who plans a surprise at midnight?" Jake's unease deepened. "Sounds weird." "It gets weirder," Lily added. "I heard some of the kids saying this place has a history, like missing campers and stuff." Emma rolled her eyes. That's just campfire stories. Every camp has them. Jake wasn't so sure. His gut told him there was something more to it. He decided to keep his suspicions to himself for now. The morning activity was a scavenger hunt through the woods. Jake ended up paired with Marcus and Tyler, the boys from his cabin. Marcus treated it like a competition, racing ahead while Tyler muttered complaints about the heat and bugs. The forest was beautiful, but disorienting. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the trees were closing in, their gnarled branches intertwining above like skeletal hands. Jake noticed something strange about the forest floor. Symbols carved into rocks and scratched into the dirt. They were similar to the ones he'd seen in the cabin, but here they seemed older, more deliberate. "Hey, check this out," Marcus called, holding up a rusted canteen. "Vintage treasure, right?" Jake's eyes drifted past Marcus to a large tree behind him. Its bark was covered in the same strange carvings. They seemed to pulsate faintly, as if alive. "Let's move," Jake said abruptly, his voice sharper than intended. Marcus frowned. "What's your problem?" "I just don't think we should hang around here." Tyler glanced at the tree and shivered. "Yeah, let's get out of here." As they made their way back, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. The forest was too quiet now, the kind of silence that made every step sound like a gunshot. When they finally broke through the tree line and back into the campgrounds, Jake's tension eased. But as he glanced over his shoulder, he thought he saw movement in the shadows, something tall, misshapen, and impossibly fast. By the time he turned fully, it was gone. The scavenger hunt left Jake on edge, and he wasn't alone. Back at the cabins, Tyler muttered something about the forest being too creepy, but Marcus brushed it off, calling him a coward. Jake didn't argue, but the image of the carvings and the shadowy figure lingered in his mind like a splinter he couldn't dislodge. Later that afternoon, while the other campers participated in archery practice, Jake decided to explore the campgrounds. Emma joined him, claiming she was bored of hitting hay bales. The two wandered off the main trail, where the camp seemed to shift into something wilder and less maintained. "This place is huge," Emma said, stepping over a fallen log. "Feels like it just goes on forever." "That's what bothers me," Jake replied. "No one ever says where the camp boundaries are." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. They've got us out here in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest, and no one's mentioned where it ends. It's like they don't want us to know." Emma didn't respond, but Jake could tell she was thinking about it. They pressed on until they came across a small clearing. In its center was something that didn't belong, a structure made of stone, worn and moss-covered, with faint carvings etched into its surface. It looked like an altar. "What the hell is this?" Emma asked, her voice a mix of awe and fear. Jake knelt beside the structure, running his fingers over the carvings. They were the same symbols he'd seen in the cabin in the forest, but here they seemed more intricate, almost intentional in their placement. The stone felt cold, unnaturally so, despite the summer heat. "It's old," Jake said. "Really old." Emma frowned. "Why would a summer camp have something like this? It doesn't make any sense." Jake was about to respond when a rustling noise came from the trees behind them. They both froze, their eyes locking in silent agreement. Slowly, Jake turned toward the sound, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Probably just an animal," Emma whispered, though her voice wavered. Jake wasn't so sure. He reached into his pocket where he'd hidden a small utility knife. It wasn't much, but it made him feel slightly less vulnerable. The rustling grew louder, and then a squirrel darted out of the bushes, chittering as it scampered up a tree. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Jesus, that scared me." Jake forced a chuckle, though his grip on the knife didn't loosen. "Yeah, just a squirrel." They decided to head back, but as they left the clearing, Jake glanced over his shoulder at the altar. For a split second he thought he saw something move near it, a faint shadowy shape that seemed to blend with the surrounding trees. He blinked, and it was gone. When they returned to camp, the counselors were waiting. Their cheerful smiles seemed tighter, more strained. Mr. Eric stepped forward, his gaze flicking between Jake and Emma. "Having fun exploring?" he asked, his tone light but carrying an undertone Jake didn't like. Yeah, Emma said quickly, just checking out the trails. Mr. Eric's smile widened. Well, make sure you stick to the marked paths. It's easy to get lost out here. Jake nodded, but his unease grew. The counselors weren't just trying to keep them safe. They were trying to keep them from discovering something. And whatever that was, it had to be connected to the altar. That night, the camp was unusually quiet. The usual hum of chatter and laughter around the fire pit was subdued, replaced by the crackling of flames and the occasional murmur from the counselors. Jake and Emma sat near the edge of the group exchanging uneasy glances. Even Marcus, usually the loudest, seemed subdued. As the group dispersed to their cabins, the night stretched on in an oppressive silence. Jake couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wooden beams, every whisper of wind through the trees outside made his skin prickle. His mind kept returning to the altar, the carvings, and the fleeting shadow he thought he'd seen. Sometime after midnight he heard it, footsteps outside the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, crunching faintly on the dirt path. Jake sat up, holding his breath. The other boys were sound asleep, their soft snores filling the cabin. He strained to listen, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Jake's hand slid under his pillow, gripping the handle of his utility knife. The doorknob rattled faintly, then stopped. He waited, his muscles tense, but nothing happened. Minutes passed, and the footsteps receded into the distance. By morning, Jake convinced himself it was just a counselor making rounds, but when the sun rose and the campers gathered for breakfast, one of them was missing. Has anyone seen Lily? A counselor asked, her voice calm, but her smile strained. The question hung in the air, and an uneasy murmur rippled through the group. Jake's stomach dropped. Lily hadn't been at the fire pit the previous night, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. She was in cabin 4 last night, Emma said, her voice tight. I saw her before lights out. Maybe she wandered off, Mr. Eric said, his tone light but oddly dismissive. We'll form a search party after breakfast, no need to panic. Jake's hands clenched into fists. No need to panic? A camper had gone missing, and the counselors were acting like it was just a minor inconvenience. He looked at Emma, and the fear in her eyes mirrored his own. The search party was a joke. The counselors led the campers in a perfunctory sweep of the main trails, calling Lily's name with little urgency. Jake and Emma exchanged glances, but said nothing. It was clear the counselors weren't really looking for her. When the search ended without success, the counselors herded the campers back to the mess hall, where Mr. Eric gave a reassuring speech about remaining calm and sticking to camp rules. Jake could barely listen. His mind was racing, replaying the sound of those footsteps outside his cabin. Later that day, Jake and Emma found a chance to speak alone. They slipped away from the group, retreating to a quiet spot near the edge of the lake. This isn't right, Emma said. They don't care that Lily's gone. It's like they expected this. Jake nodded. And what was that about sticking to the rules? They know something, I'm sure of it. Emma hesitated, then leaned closer. I think we should go back to that altar. There has to be a connection. Jake didn't want to admit it, but she was right. The altar, the carvings, the counselor's strange behavior, it all felt tied together. And if they were going to figure out what was happening, they'd have to take a risk. We'll go tonight, Jake said, after lights out. Emma nodded, her face pale but resolute. We need to find out the truth. But as they returned to the group, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the counselors, but by something else entirely. Night fell over Camp Willowbrook, the oppressive silence broken only by the occasional creak of a tree branch or the rustle of leaves. Jake and Emma waited until the camp settled, listening carefully for the counselors making their final rounds. When the last set of footsteps faded, they slipped out of their cabins and into the cool, damp night. Armed with flashlights and Jake's utility knife, they retraced their steps to the clearing where the stone altar stood. The journey through the forest felt longer this time, the trees closing in tighter, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for them. They arrived at the clearing, breathless and on edge. The altar loomed in the center, its carvings faintly visible in the moonlight. Emma took a cautious step forward, running her fingers along the symbols etched into the surface. These markings, she whispered, They look alive, breathing. Jake knelt beside the altar, his flashlight revealing faint traces of dried red stains near the base. His stomach churned as the realization hit him. "This is a sacrificial altar," he said, his voice hollow. "They've been using this." Before Emma could respond, Jake's flashlight beam caught something buried in the dirt nearby. He knelt, brushing away the loose soil to uncover a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and weathered, but the pages inside were intact. He flipped through them, his hands trembling. The journal was written by a camper, decades ago, if the dates were accurate. The entries began innocently enough, descriptions of hikes, camp activities, and friendships. But as Jake skimmed further, the tone shifted. The camper wrote of strange dreams, whispers in the forest, and counselors behaving oddly. Then came the final entry. "They took Henry last night. I saw them drag him to the altar. They were chanting something in a language I've never heard. I wanted to scream, to stop them, but I couldn't move. This place isn't a camp. It's a trap. They're feeding us to something they worship. I don't think I'll make it out." Emma read over Jake's shoulder, her face pale. "This can't be real," she whispered. "It's just a story, right?" Jake shook his head. "The carvings, the altar, the missing kids, it all lines up." Before they could say more, a rustling sound came from the trees. Jake turned his flashlight toward the noise, his hand tightening on the knife. The beam caught movement, figures stepping into the clearing, their faces hidden behind crude wooden masks. "Counselors." "Stay where you are," one of them said, their voice calm but commanding. Emma grabbed Jake's arm. "Run," she hissed. They bolted into the forest, the flashlight bouncing wildly as they sprinted through the underbrush. Behind them, the counselors gave chase, their footsteps fast and purposeful. Jake's heart pounded as he weaved between the trees, his mind racing. They broke through the tree line and into the campgrounds, darting behind one of the cabins. Jake pressed his back against the rough wood, trying to catch his breath. Emma crouched beside him, her face etched with fear. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Jake peeked around the corner, scanning the shadows for movement. "We need proof," he said. "Something we can show to the others." Emma nodded reluctantly. "But how? They're everywhere." "We'll find a way," Jake said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The journal was a start, but if the counselors were willing to chase them through the woods, they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. As the sounds of pursuit faded, Jake realized they weren't just fighting for answers, they were fighting to survive. The next morning, the atmosphere at Camp Willowbrook was different. The counselors were even more cheerful than usual, their grins unnervingly wide as they moved about their routines. Jake and Emma, bleary-eyed from their harrowing escape the previous night, sat at the far end of the mess hall, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "What now?" Emma whispered, glancing nervously at Mr. Eric, who was overseeing the breakfast line with an almost predatory calm. Jake leaned in close. "We can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine. We need to find a way to expose them." Emma hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the stolen journal. "If they catch us, we're next. You know that, right?" Jake nodded grimly. "That's why we need the others. If we can convince enough campers to stand with us, they can't silence all of us." Before Emma could respond, Mr. Eric's voice boomed across the mess hall. "Good morning, everyone. Today's schedule is packed with exciting activities, including a special gathering tonight at the fire pit. You won't want to miss it." Jake felt his stomach churn. The way Mr. Eric said "special gathering" made his skin crawl. It was no longer just an item on the schedule. It was a veiled threat. The rest of the day passed in a haze of forced activities. Jake and Emma tried to blend in, their every move shadowed by the watchful eyes of the counselors. During free time, they quietly approached some of the campers they trusted, Tyler, Ben, and a few others, carefully sharing what they had learned. Tyler was skeptical at first. "You're telling me the counselors are running some kind of cult? Come on, man, that sounds like something out of a movie." Jake opened the journal and flipped to the final entry. "Read this," he said, "and tell me it's just a story." Tyler's expression shifted as he read, his face paling with each line. This can't be real," he stammered. "It is," Emma said, "and if we don't do something, it's only going to get worse." Ben, quiet as ever, simply nodded. "I believe you," he said softly. "I felt it since the first day. This place isn't right." With their small group assembled, Jake and Emma began devising a plan. The goal was simple: survive the night. They would keep watch, stay together, and, if necessary, fight back. As night fell, the campers gathered at the fire pit for the special gathering. The counselors' cheerful demeanor had morphed into something more solemn, their yellow uniforms replaced with dark robes adorned with the same strange symbols carved into the altar. Jake and Emma exchanged tense glances as Mr. Eric stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. "Tonight," he said, "we honor an ancient tradition, a tradition that ensures prosperity for all who remain." Jake's hand tightened around the hunting rifle he'd smuggled from the supply shed earlier that day. The others didn't know about it yet, but he wasn't taking any chances. The counselors began chanting in a guttural, inhuman language. The flames in the fire pit grew unnaturally high, casting twisted shadows across the gathered campers. Jake's group huddled together, their fear palpable. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to tremble. From the shadows beyond the fire pit, a shape began to emerge, a towering, grotesque figure with too many limbs and eyes that seemed to pierce through Jake's soul. "Now," Jake whispered, his voice firm, "we fight." As the monstrous figure loomed closer, Jake raised his rifle, took aim, and prepared to do whatever it took to survive. The grotesque figure emerging from the shadows was unlike anything Jake had ever imagined. Its body was a nightmare of twisted limbs, each one moving independently with an eerie grace. Its countless eyes glistened in the firelight, reflecting the terror etched on the faces of the campers. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay and something ancient, something wrong. Jake steadied his rifle, his hands trembling but his resolve firm. The cult's chanting grew louder, a guttural symphony that seemed to reverberate in his chest. Emma clung to his arm, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The other campers in their small group huddled behind them, paralyzed by fear. "Stop this," Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Let them go." Mr. Eric turned to face Jake, his expression unnervingly calm. "You don't understand, Jake," he said, his voice carrying over the chanting. "The devourer protects us. Its hunger ensures our safety, our prosperity. The sacrifices are necessary." Jake's grip tightened on the rifle. "You're insane." "Am I?" Mr. Eric gestured toward the towering entity. "Look at it. This is power beyond your comprehension. The missing campers, they've become part of something greater, a gift to ensure our survival." "Survival?" Emma spat. "You're feeding innocent kids to that thing." Mr. Eric sighed, almost as if he pitied them. "You're too young to understand. You'll see in time." Jake wasn't about to let time prove anything. The creature had stopped moving, its myriad eyes fixed on the campers as if studying them. Jake didn't wait for it to make the first move. He raised the rifle, aimed for one of the creature's eyes, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the still night. The bullet struck true, hitting one of the central eyes with a sickening squelch. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural roar that shook the ground and extinguished the fire in the pit. Darkness enveloped the clearing, broken only by the pale light of the moon. Chaos erupted. The counselors abandoned their calm facade, lunging toward Jake and the campers. Jake swung the rifle like a club, knocking one counselor to the ground as he yelled for the others to run. Emma grabbed a heavy branch from the ground, swinging it with surprising ferocity to keep another counselor at bay. "Move," Jake shouted, firing another shot into the air to scatter the cultists. The creature writhed, its movements erratic as if blinded by the injury. Its rage sent shockwaves through the ground, toppling some of the campers as they scrambled toward the forest. Jake and Emma led the way, the small group weaving through the trees in a desperate bid to escape. Behind them, the counselors' chants resumed, louder and more frantic, as if trying to call the creature back under their control. "We can't outrun that thing," Tyler shouted, his face pale with terror. "We don't have to outrun it," Jake said grimly, his mind racing. "I have a hunch it can't stay in our world for long. We just have to survive till then." As they ran, the forest seemed to shift and twist around them, the air growing colder with every step. The creature's roar echoed through the trees, a chilling reminder that their ordeal was far from over. Jake's every instinct screamed at him to keep moving, to protect the group at all costs. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the lake, the water shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Jake turned, his rifle at the ready, as the monstrous figure loomed in the distance. It was slower now, its movement sluggish and jerky, but it was still coming. Emma grabbed his arm. "We can't fight it here. We don't have a choice," Jake said, raising the rifle again. "If we don't stop it now, we're dead." The creature let out another roar, and Jake took aim, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jake fired again, the rifle's crack splitting the night air. The bullet struck one of the creature's legs, forcing it to stagger but not stop. It roared in fury, its guttural cry reverberating across the lake's surface, sending ripples through the water. The campers cowered behind Jake and Emma, their fear palpable. "We can't take this thing down," Tyler yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "It's too big." Jake ignored him, firing another shot. This one hit a shoulder-like appendage, sending chunks of its grotesque flesh spraying into the air. The creature faltered again but didn't fall. It was resilient, impossibly so, and Jake knew they were running out of options. "Emma, take the others and get to the far side of the lake," Jake ordered. "Stick to the shore and keep moving. I'll hold it off." Emma's eyes widened. "Are you insane? You can't fight that thing alone." "Just go," Jake shouted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "If we stick together, it'll catch all of us. You need to get them out of here." Emma hesitated but nodded, her face grim. She grabbed Tyler and Ben, pulling them toward the water's edge. "Come on. We don't have time." The campers reluctantly followed, their movements clumsy with fear. Jake turned his attention back to the creature, which was closing the distance. It moved with a terrifying purpose, each step shaking the ground beneath him. Jake took a deep breath, steadying his aim. His hands no longer trembled. He couldn't afford fear now. He fired again, aiming for its torso. The bullet tore through its flesh, and for the first time, the creature let out a sound that wasn't rage, it was pain. The revelation was brief but significant. This thing could be hurt, it wasn't invincible. Jake adjusted his stance, readying himself for another shot, but before he could fire, the counselors appeared from the tree line. They were no longer trying to hide their intentions. Clad in dark robes, they carried crude weapons, knives, clubs, and spears adorned with the same eldritch symbols as the altar. Their faces were obscured by masks, but their movements were determined. Jake's heart sank. He couldn't fight them all, not with the creature bearing down on him. Still, he refused to back down. He took aim at the nearest counselor, firing a warning shot that splintered a tree trunk beside them. "Stay back," he yelled. The counselors paused, clearly startled, but Mr. Eric stepped forward, his mask pushed back to reveal a serene expression. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed, Jake," he said, his tone almost paternal. "The devourer demands sacrifice, yes, but it rewards those who serve. Lay down your weapon and you can join us." Jake barked out a bitter laugh. "You think I'd ever join you after what you've done?" Mr. Eric sighed, shaking his head. "Such a waste." With a nod from Eric, the counselors advanced. Jake fired again, this time hitting a cultist in the leg. They crumpled with a scream, but the others kept coming. Jake backed up, the rifle's weight a comforting presence in his hands, but he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. Behind him the creature roared again, its pace quickening despite its injuries. Jake was caught between two nightmares, the cult and their monstrous god. He turned and sprinted toward the lake, hoping to draw both away from the others. As he reached the water's edge, he glanced back. The counselors were chanting again, their voices rising in a chilling crescendo. The creature stopped as if listening and turned its many eyes toward Jake. "Come on," Jake muttered, his voice trembling. "Come and get me." He plunged into the lake, the icy water stealing his breath. The creature roared and followed, its massive form crashing into the shallows. Jake swam with every ounce of strength he had, praying he could lead it far enough away for the others to escape. The water churned violently behind him as the creature closed in, and Jake realized he was running out of time. The lake was colder than Jake expected, its icy grip numbing his limbs as he swam with everything he had. Behind him, the creature thrashed into the water, its massive limbs tearing through the surface like a nightmare brought to life. The counselors stood at the shoreline, their chants growing louder, their guttural tones twisting the air into something almost tangible. Jake glanced over his shoulder. The monster's movements were sluggish in the water, its massive bulk struggling against the resistance. But it was still gaining on him. He could feel the waves of its pursuit rippling around him, pushing him toward the center of the lake. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't outrun it forever, and he was rapidly running out of energy. He needed a plan, a way to stop the creature once and for all. Then his eyes fell on a cluster of jagged rocks jutting out of the water near the far edge of the lake. If he could lure the creature there, with a renewed sense of purpose, Jake swam toward the rocks, his chest burning with exertion. The closer he got, the more treacherous the waters became, the currents swirling unpredictably around the sharp black stones. Behind him, the creature let out another bone-rattling roar, its many eyes fixed on him. Jake reached the rocks and scrambled onto one, the rough surface cutting into his palms. He turned to face the monster, raising his rifle. His hands were shaking from the cold, but he steadied himself, aiming for the creature's head. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Let's end this." The creature lunged, its grotesque body surging forward. Jake fired, the shot echoing across the lake. The bullet struck one of its central eyes, and the beast reeled back, roaring in pain. Jake fired again and again, each shot finding its mark. The creature faltered, its massive limbs slamming against the rocks. The water churned violently as the beast thrashed, its roars turning into guttural howls. Jake kept firing until his rifle clicked empty, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but the creature wasn't dead. Not yet. Desperation clawed at Jake as he reached for his sidearm, his hands fumbling with the weapon. The creature let out a deafening roar and lunged again, its limbs crashing into the rocks and sending Jake sprawling. The handgun slipped from his grasp, skittering across the slick stone. Jake scrambled backward, his heart pounding as the monster loomed over him. Its many eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its grotesque mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth. This was it. He was out of time. Then he saw it. The jagged edge of a rock jutting out from the water, directly beneath the creature. The idea hit him like a lightning bolt. Jake stood, his legs trembling, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Hey, you want me? Come and get me." The creature roared and lunged one final time, its massive bulk surging forward. At the last second, Jake dove to the side, landing hard on the rock as the beast's momentum carried it onto the jagged stone. The impact was thunderous. The rock pierced the creature's body, splitting it open with a sickening squelch. A guttural scream tore through the night as the beast convulsed, its massive limbs flailing wildly before going still. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the creature's body began to dissolve, its form collapsing into a black, viscous sludge that sank into the water. The counselors' chanting stopped abruptly, their voices replaced by panicked shouts. Jake lay on the rock, his chest heaving, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The lake was eerily calm now, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the rocks. He had done it. The creature was gone. But his relief was short-lived. On the distant shore, the counselors regrouped, their silhouettes illuminated by the moonlight. Even from this distance, Jake could see the fury in their movements. This wasn't over yet. Jake dragged himself off the jagged rocks, his body aching and his limbs trembling from exhaustion. The lake felt eerily still now, the oppressive presence of the creature gone, but he knew his fight wasn't over. The counselors stood on the shore, their dark robes billowing in the night breeze, their furious shouts carrying across the water. He slipped back into the lake, swimming toward the far shore where Emma and the others had fled. Every stroke sent sharp pains through his shoulders and chest, but he pushed through, his mind singularly focused on survival. He had to reach them. He had to get them out. When Jake finally reached the far shore, Emma was there, waiting, her face pale but determined. "You're alive," she breathed, helping him out of the water. Tyler and Ben emerged from the trees behind her, their faces a mixture of relief and fear. "What happened?" Emma asked as Jake caught his breath. "It's gone," Jake said between gasps. "The thing, it's dead, but the counselors, they're coming." Emma's face hardened. "We have to go, now." The group moved as quickly as they could through the dense forest, the moonlight their only guide. The counselors' voices echoed in the distance, their shouts growing louder as they closed the gap. Jake kept his rifle slung over his shoulder, now empty, and gripped his sidearm tightly, its weight a small comfort despite the overwhelming odds. As they ran, the forest seemed to open up, the oppressive trees thinning until they stumbled onto a gravel road. Jake's heart leapt. They were out of the campgrounds. Headlights appeared in the distance, a vehicle approaching fast. Jake stepped into the road, waving his arms frantically. The truck screeched to a halt, and the driver, a grizzled man in a ranger uniform, jumped out. "What the hell's going on here?" the ranger demanded, his eyes darting between the kids. "There's a cult," Jake said breathlessly. "At the camp. They're trying to kill us." The ranger didn't question them. He gestured to the truck. "Get in, now!" The kids piled into the truck's cab, and the ranger slammed on the gas, speeding away from the camp. In the rearview mirror, Jake saw the counselors emerge onto the road, their dark robes stark against the pale moonlight. They didn't chase the truck. They simply stood there, watching, their silhouettes ominous and unmoving. In the days that followed, the authorities arrived at Camp Willowbrook. The counselors had vanished, the campgrounds abandoned, and no trace of the monstrous creature or the altar remained. Jake and the other survivors were questioned extensively, but their story was met with skepticism. Without evidence, the events of that night were chalked up to hysteria and overactive imaginations. Jake returned home, but he was never the same. The nights were the hardest. He couldn't sleep without hearing the guttural chants of the cult or seeing the monstrous figure rising from the shadows of his dreams. His parents tried to help, but there was no fixing what he had experienced. Sometimes he thought about the counselors, where they had gone, if they were still out there, searching for another place to carry out their twisted rituals. He thought about the altar, the ancient symbols, and the creature. And he thought about the journal he had kept, hidden away in a locked drawer. A piece of proof, a reminder of what he'd survived, and a warning to himself that the world wasn't as simple as he once believed. Jake ended his recounting with a chilling message. If you ever hear about Camp Willowbrook reopening, don't go. Whatever they worshipped, whatever they fed, it's still out there, waiting.